Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about deviance and social control. Whenever we're talking about deviance, we're simply referring to anything that violates social norms. And of course, social norms are just the rules that are constructed by individuals in society that we accept as a group and then enforce. There are informal social norms such as not cutting in line, not swearing, not going to McDonald's and paying in all pennies because it backs up the line, for example. Then there are formal social norms, such as things that are backed up by laws, such as when you commit a crime and the police get involved. So, again, the idea of what deviance is based upon cultural values, beliefs, and overall ideologies. Deviance in itself, there's no such thing as a deviant act. What is deviant is actually what we label as deviant as a society. Therefore, what is labeled as deviant is based upon the culture of reference. For example, in some cultures, something might be deviant, but in other cultures, it's completely acceptable. And the way I like to think about this is, back in the day, if we were Vikings, would we have encouraged our children to go over to England and pillage? Okay? Is that a deviant act? Nowadays, handing your child a sword and saying go over to England and pillage would be considered a deviant act. But if we were Vikings, that would be considered totally normal. Murder in general is considered a deviant act based upon social norms, but what happens when a soldier goes to war? What makes one act murder and another act heroic? Is it the motive? Okay? So we need to be thinking about deviance in terms of social norms, meaning the rules of society, and anything that deviates from these social norms gets labeled as deviant. But we also need to be constantly questioning social norms. For example, if it was the 1950s, an African American and somebody who identifies as white being a couple and getting married, might have received incredible amount of stigmatization, prejudice, and discrimination that could have also resulted in violence, for example, because interracial marriage in the 1950s was incredibly taboo. If we don't question our social norms, then racism would take over our lives, for example. So by us questioning the norms about race and interracial marriage, for example, we have challenged social norms and we have changed our attitudes as a society to be more equitable toward other people. Same thing goes with homosexuality. If it was 50 years ago, it would have been very difficult for me to say I am gay out loud without fear of stigmatization, prejudice, discrimination, and violence. However, in modern times, it's more acceptable to say something like I am gay without receiving the prejudice and discrimination that's attached to it. Up until 1973, identifying as homosexual would have resulted in social control in the form of you being labeled with a psychological disorder and thrown in an institution. Because social norms said that homosexuality deviate from, the rules. Therefore, what did society do to socially control sexuality? They literally threw people in institutions. Is that fair? Or maybe we should be questioning some of the social norms. However, some social norms are good. We need some social norms. Otherwise, I'd have to sleep with a gun underneath my pillow every night out of fear that someone would break in my house. So rules and then laws that, encourage not stealing, not killing, not committing violent acts. These are good purposes. And yes, we should question them, but we might find that some social norms are good and some social norms are bad. So we need to be asking about the rules themselves. But again, within each culture, the rules differ. Okay? So some cultures might think something is normal and another might think it's abnormal. Okay, so again, what is deviant is a cultural construction. It's society labeling what is a norm violation, what is acceptable, what is not. And it's also applying the proper form of social control. We don't arrest people for cutting in line, but we do arrest people for stealing. So again, the way that we control things, okay, is also influenced by that. But then deviance is so much more than criminology, again, and it's also influences how we behave in general. Because again, it's like for a boy to cry after puberty, for example. Does that violate social norms? And so if we tell boys they can't cry, how is that associated with their developing emotional intelligence, for example? Are we actually stemming men's growth because we, as a society, socially control men expressing and coping with their emotions, for example. Is that one reason why women are getting more college degrees in modern times than men? Is it because women are allowed to cry and men are not? Therefore, women are allowed to develop their emotional intelligence and boys are not. And maybe that's helping them succeed, and that's why boys are failing when it comes to, getting college educational attainment. Why is that disparity there? Is it because of women's rights? Because historically we labeled it deviant for women to go to college, and now in modern times women are allowed to go to college, for example. But again, when we deviate from the rules, like a woman going to college, which historically was very taboo, now it's totally normal. But again, we had to question the social norms that were subjugating women for years. An African American being a manager would have been unheard of in the 1950s. However, in modern times, you have an African American being a manager of a country, our country. Amazing change. So, how much do the rules, though, then structure your behavior? So, example, again, if you're told to act like a guy and then you act girly, what does society do? Do they make fun of you? And if you're a girl and you act too much like a boy, what do they do? Do you get socially controlled? Think about it. So anytime that we deviate from our gender roles, when we deviate from social norms, for example, okay, then we oftentimes get labeled as deviant, and then we get socially controlled for those actions. Okay, so again, it's not the act itself that makes something deviant, it's how society reacts to it. It's a cultural impression of what deviance is, what actions are deviant, and then the punishment or the social control that should be applied when somebody deviates from the rules. Okay, again, we need rules. Without rules, there'd be no stability. It would be kind of anarchist. And again, it'd be a little bit more scary of a society. We need some rules, okay, but not all the rules are good. So we need to be questioning the rules. But we also need to understand what happens when you break the rules. Again, if you cut in line, what happens? You get socially controlled real quick. If you walk into McDonald's and pay with all pennies, the people behind you in line are going to say something to you about that. Again, if you are a girl and you wear a tux to prom, do you get labeled with the stereotype? Okay, and again, these are just examples of how we are socially controlled and how norms are enforced in society. Okay, so again, if someone breaks the rules, are they a deviant? But then think about it. How many times have you guys deviated from the rules in the last week? Anybody drive 1 mile an hour over the speed limit? Because that would violate social norms, which is the speed limit. Does that make you a deviant? And so again, how we label people, how we label them as deviant has a huge effect upon their life, and it also affects their mind, the way they think about themselves, for example. Okay, so we should be cautious before we label somebody a deviant. Once a felon, always a felon. Is that an accurate statement? Or once a felon made a mistake, then they've done their time. Now we should let them be and not label them anymore, for example. So again, just different perspectives of that. So stigma is a term that is used to attach to anything that violates social norms. We stigmatize people that deviate from the rules by labeling them felons, by labeling them criminals, by institutionalizing them. And again, if it was the 1950s and the murder of Emmett Till, an African American young teenager, maybe supposedly looked at a white girl, maybe said hello, and then 2 white men came and murdered Emmett Till because he spoke to a white girl. This then inspires the bus boycotts and Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement. And it all stemmed from a deviation from a social norm. Someone who was black maybe talked to somebody who was white, and they murdered him for it. And again, so how do we enforce racist policies? How do we enforce sexist policies? You can see how that was done for years. People were socialized into racist policies and socialized into sexist policies. So again, we need to be challenging these social norms. Otherwise, you would continuously have black men being murdered just for existing, because that's how society was. It was a very dark and unhappy place for minorities. Okay, women and all other minorities have received incredible amounts of prejudice and discrimination simply for violating social norms by existing, because maybe their skin color didn't match the right color, which again is why we need to be constantly challenging the rules. Okay, so stigma, stigmatization, this is the labels that we apply to people. Okay, So a stigma is attributes that discredits one's claim to a normal identity. So basically saying anything non-white, not normal, non-heterosexual, not normal. So you have these terms of heteronormativity, for example, and racist ideology where one race is superior to another, and then we stigmatize those that are in the subjugated group. And it's very dark and very sad. And so again, not everything in society is pretty. And so we are studying society, groups of people, but when we look back on the history of groups of people, a lot of it's very dark. So again, I've always got the disclaimer when you teach sociology that we have to look at the good, the bad, and everything in between. You know, that's the only way we're going to understand things, and we're going to take a biopsychosocial approach to it. Okay, all right. So again, without social norms, chaos would exist. We need some stability. We need predictability in society just to make things function right. You know, a car engine should work the same way each time. Sometimes we need to update the cars and make them better, stronger, you know, more improved. But in general, we need some kind of stability, some kind of balance in our life. Otherwise, you can't have any predictable behavior, and I won't know what to expect at any one time. You want to be able to feel safe when you're going home at sleep, okay? So again, we need some forms of social control. We give up some of our rights in America for social control, okay? Because that's just part of group behavior. In order for everyone to get along with the group, not everybody can always be totally free. We have to restrict some parts of our human behavior. Because again, humans are violent. They commit violence acts. Humans rape 1 out of 4 women, abuse 1 out of 5 children. Okay, so if left to our own biological animal selves, what would humanity actually be like? So again, having these roles, having these social control, having ways of enforcing the rules is very important. Yes, I can totally see why we need laws against child abuse, okay? But do we really need a law that says that a black man can't vote and neither can a woman? Do we really need a law that says that a homosexual is gay? I mean, that someone who identifies as gay has a psychological disorder. So again, it's very good that we've been challenging social norms for many years in order to create a more equitable world with less prejudice and less discrimination for people that identify with minority statuses. Okay, so some of the rules need question, but some rules need upheld, if only for the safety of other people. Okay? So again, formal rules, these are your legal rules, policies, procedures that have been, you know, evaluated and bureaucratized. Then you have your informal rules, which is simply someone cuts in a line, you say, hey, that's not appreciated, that kind of thing. Okay? So, deviance and conformity are reinforced or extinguished through the use of sanctions. Okay, when you deviate from the norms, you receive sanctions. You steal, the police come for you. You murder, the police come for you. But then you do something nice and you follow the rules, you get a gold star. Think about elementary school. Everybody gets in line, they all line up together, everyone does it right, everybody gets a gold star. We're rewarding conformity. So again, we all conform to these social norms. And a lot of the conformity is pressured because if you don't conform to the social norms, you can be sanctioned, okay? So again, we need to always take a biopsychosocial approach whenever we're studying social sciences so we can really understand everything, including history and economics and philosophy and all of that stuff too. Okay, but how much of your deviance is based upon biological factors? Again, how much of it is hormones and human aggression and sexuality drives? Okay? I mean, you got to ask, why do people beat their children? But then again, Asians, for example, only 0.5% of child abuse is by Asians, and 25% of people that are white and black abuse their children. So maybe it's a cultural thing. Or maybe it's just cognition, your attitudes toward abuse, the way you think about abuse. Do you think you should hit your child? If your child crosses the street and they're 3 years old and there's cars, should you hit your child in that circumstance? Do you believe in spanking? But again, how much of our physical aggression and things like that, and why the count for 1 in 4 women with rape, that's insane. That's completely insane. I have a daughter. Trust me, I'm always afraid. I'm always wondering, you know, do you need a chastity belt just for a woman to be safe in modern times? Because 1 in 4 is crazy. But then again, how much of that's biology and how much of that's cultural? That's the male-dominated society and, sexist attitudes and ideologies How much of that's alcohol? Why is it when you're 18 to 24, you're twice as likely to be raped? Or if you're in a sorority, are you twice as likely to be raped, for example? So again, how much is deviance, like murder, rape, violence, biological factors? Is that part of being human? How much of that's your cognitions and the way you think? And how much of that's sociocultural? Because again, in murder to a Viking was totally normal. Going to England and committing rape and murder, that was a way of life. It was a culture. If I was an Apache native, I would be doing the same thing. I would go down to Mexico and I would raid. The precursors to Genghis Khan would go into China and raid all the northern border towns, which is how you ended up getting the Great Wall of China. So how much of violent innate behavior is part of humanity's biology? Okay, and do we need social controls? And again, this is why we need some social controls, because if left to our own behavior, would our biological animalistic side come out? So therefore, we need some social controls. Again, in order for the group to get along with the group, to have some form of stability, for example, okay? But again, you need to be wondering how much of what we do. I mean, if you're hungry, do you steal? You know what I mean? So how much of that's influenced by your biology? And then again, how much of it's cognitions? And then sociological explanations is looking at things like poverty. How much of committing crimes, drug use, increased rates of violence, increased rates of abuse, how much of that is associated with poverty? Because as poverty increases, so do rates of drug use and violence and child abuse and criminal behavior. As poverty decreases, that tends to go away. Same with education level. As education level increases, negative attitudes toward races and sexism and all that goes down. All the other healthcare concerns go down. Okay, so you need to be thinking about this from a biopsychosocial perspective. Could we reduce crime and reduce deviance simply if we ended poverty? Okay, just stuff to be thinking about. So, a symbolic interactionist perspective. This talks about got a couple of theories that go underneath this main heading. And again, symbolic interactionism is the idea that we construct society and we also apply meanings attached to actions. So therefore, deviance is simply us exchanging symbolic communication, okay, and deciding amongst ourselves what we deem as deviant and what we deem as not. Differential association theory is this idea that if you hang out with a bunch of people that are criminals, it's just going to seem totally normal for you. Committing crimes doesn't seem deviant. Society might label you as deviant, but that's normal to them. Okay, that's differential association theory. Control theory says that we all need some forms of social control. Okay, if without social control, yes, there'd be anarchy and the lack of predictability, lack of stability. But, again, how much of that biological side comes out? Does it make for a more dangerous society, for example? So we all need a little bit of police in our lives. We need a little bit of a parent's authority or a teacher's authority. We need a little bit of discipline because this keeps in check a lot of those inappropriate behaviors that don't match with social norms. Labeling theory is the idea, again, once a felon, always a felon. If you label somebody as a felon, are they just going to say, the heck with it, I give up? They're not going to hire me. I mean, I've got a felony, so why not just keep committing crimes, right? So how much of the labeling affects a person's psychology, okay? Their way their mind works and the way they think about themselves, okay? What about the effect of negative stereotypes? How do negative stereotypes affect people? And again, you need to be thinking about all these things. The functionalist perspective, again, says that we create rules and we determine what is deviance because there's a purpose for that. There's a reason for it. It somehow structures society, structures behavior. Therefore, we socially construct social rules, social norms, so that society functions better. Therefore, if we create laws against murdering and killing, people tend to be safer, stability in society tends to increase, okay? Strength theory says people commit crimes basically because we're poor. Again, if you reduce poverty and you reduce strain on people's lives, will deviance decrease? Okay, and again, some form of deviance is always going to exist, but maybe some of those more extreme forms of deviance that are caused from poverty, like drug use and, just stealing and things along those lines, what happens if we reduce strain? Does deviance go down? Okay, illegitimate opportunity theory is an intersectional theory that looks at the association between committing deviances and social class. And it says, do people in upper classes commit different types of crimes than people in the lower classes? People in the upper classes tend to commit crimes that they have access to, which is why they can commit white-collar crime, because they have access to computer systems and stock portfolios and mutual funds. Somebody that's in poverty doesn't have that kind of access, so they can't commit that type of crime, so they might lean more toward drugs and guns and other types of like robbery and burglary, for example. The conflict perspective says that people deviate from the norms because the norms of society are created by those in power. Okay, and so people that don't match the social norms of the dominant culture that is in power tend to deviate from that rule because the norms don't represent them. The social norms represent those in power. Okay, so again, reactions to deviance, there's degradation ceremonies where, we ritually mark you, like the idea in Vichy, France, when they shaved the French girls' heads if they had been with a German, for example. In prison, or back in the day, when they, kick a girl out because she was pregnant and not married. Imprisonment, again, that's a more formal method. Just put people in a holding cell and lock them down for a long time. Medicalization, again, we do this with sociopaths, people that distort from reality and just can't function in society. Again, we used to do that with people identified as homosexual, but I'm glad we have now 50 years past that. Again, and how much of deviance is associated with mental illness. Okay, so again, a little bit percentage of mental illness, but most of deviance is most likely sociocultural factors such as environment, parents, where you grew up, your neighborhood, your school, your education, things along those lines. Okay, so again, the larger issue is, do we need to have rules? Do we need rules to be able to protect each other? Do we need some forms of social control? But what rules should we have? And again, we should be constantly questioning the rules, and we should be constantly questioning and holding accountable our forms of social control. Okay? Again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.